Amelia Stories. Amelia Meets Phil, Part 1, Section 1. My grandmother came into this world as Amelia Bolde, later married as Amelia McClenny, and then later married again as Amelia Harris. She was born sometime about 1902. There's also a photo of my grandmother sitting on a pony looking rather unhappy, I might add, dated 1898. Clearly, these two documents contradict each other. The reason I point this out is that many years later, after she died, the coroner asked for her birth certificate, and clearly there was a contradiction there. Official documents for people of color at that point in time were somewhat sketchy and usually made up to satisfy some official somewhere. As a direct result of this, my grandmother was notorious about never telling anybody how old she was. She even went so far as to not celebrate her own damn birthday. And when you'd ask her how old she was, she'd look you straight in the eye and like you had 16 heads for asking the damn question and say to you with a straight face, old enough to know better. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 2, Amelia Meets Phil. The woman I knew as Amelia Harris was a strong-willed woman of unique character, honesty, and integrity, a formidable force you did not want to cross, and I did several times, much to my detriment. She suffered great emotional and physical pain in her life. I mention this because she holds a unique distinction in the annals of medical history. Unfortunately, in April of 1992, she would die due to complications from those distinctions due to an infection in her abdomen. By the time I came along in 1964, she had had a breast removed. By 1969, a second. By 1975, she had her stomach removed, and by the end of the 70s, her uterus. Not exactly a pleasant experience. She quite literally called out every single night in pain due to those complications. She had two types of cancer that quite literally aided her. Not exactly a pleasant experience for her. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 3, Amelia Meets Phil. When Amelia was a young girl, the world was just opening up to her. Unfortunately, the world was controlled by men, specifically white men. She saw herself as black, even though she wasn't. She was the last daughter of the last chief of the Massachusetts tribe, which is where the state of Massachusetts gets its name from. She was an amazing singer and dancer that quite literally had the chops to land herself on Broadway, and did. Unfortunately, that dream died. Why? Enter John McClenny, my maternal grandfather. They would later marry and have two children together, Richard in 1928 and Joe Norma, my mother, in 1930. 6 years later, he would magically disappear. He went out for milk one night and never came back. More on that later. Today's video is sponsored by Falcon Internet. Falcon Internet has been hosting my website and my databases in currently one of my boxes for the last 10 years. Mark is an amazing host. He has 99% uptime, and he's incredibly responsive. If you need a website built and hosted, if you need a database built and hosted, you need an application built in any number of different languages, then Mark at Falcon Internet is your toy. Go look him up, and he will hook you up. Falcon Internet, link down below in the description. All right, now back to the video. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 4. It was April of 1942, and the United States had entered the war in the Pacific a few months earlier, and everyone was just a little on edge and a little war crazy. Amelia, on the other hand, was just trying to make her way in the world. She took care of two families to feed her kids and to pay her bills because her husband had, quote, disappeared, unquote, 8 years earlier. One night, she had her sister babysitting so that she could go out to the USO Club for coloreds at the Navy Yards with her friends. She needed a drink. Boy, did she ever need a drink. She needed to go dancing, and she needed to blow off some steam, as she put it. She got to the club and then settled in for the night. Much to her ignorance, a young man walked into that same club, put down his Navy duffel, spotted Amelia, and then lost his damn mind. His name? Phillip Harris. Phil, as he liked to be called, had just won the proverbial military lottery. Due to his injuries, he was granted a posting of his choice anywhere in the world, or a discharge from the Navy. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 5, Amelia Meets Phil. Let's back up a bit. Phil was on the Arizona when it was attacked on the morning of December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. He had two jobs on board. The first was assistant cook, and the second was fire and damage control. The Arizona was in dock at Pearl for some minor repairs, according to the captain. That Sunday morning, when she was struck, he was in his bunk. He felt the first torpedo hit, and it was a shock to him because the Arizona was so huge that seemingly nothing could shake her. So he told me. It wasn't until the second one hit that he jumped up out of his bunk and ran up on deck to get to his position, because he knew that they were under fire. On deck, he saw that there were planes flying all over the place, bullets everywhere, guns blazing, and the deck was literally burning. Men were jumping overboard. As he got to his position, he realized that he was on fire, so he jumped into the water to put out the fire. This just one little tiny problem. Phil couldn't swim. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 6, Amelia Meets Phil. Phil came up for air just in time to see the Arizona hit with another torpedo. She was taking on water and sinking fast. As for Phil, he was too busy trying not to die. He couldn't swim, and he was in the Navy. He said to me, and I quote, "Don't ask," unquote. I didn't ask. At the time, he finally remembered to do some kind of thing that they taught him in basic, and he eventually made it to shore and then promptly passed out. He was collected, taken to the hospital, and treated for his burns and water in his lungs. He awoke several days later to find that in the Navy's infinite wisdom, it had decided to grant him a posting of his choice anywhere in the world or full discharge. He chose the latter, and they shipped him home to Boston. 4 months later, he stepped off a transport and made a beeline for the USO Club. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 7, Amelia Meets Phil. Phil walked into the club, took his duffel from his shoulder, looked up, and that's when he saw Amelia standing at the bar in front of him. Amelia had a drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other, and was talking with her hands, pointing at her girlfriends and laughing. Phil stared for a really long time before realizing that he was gawking at her. She didn't notice him. He quickly found a table, a waitress, a drink, some food, and all he could do was stare. So Phil ate, slowly, looking over at her. The food he didn't remember. However, as he would later tell me, the woman, he did. He couldn't think of anything else. He drank slowly just so that he could watch Amelia. Kind of creepy by today's standards, but as my grandfather would later tell me, when you knew, you knew. And in this case, he knew. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 8, Amelia Meets Phil. Amelia, sensing she was being watched as anyone would when they feel someone's eyes on them, turned to find who was watching her. She found him and met Phil's eyes. She knew what he wanted, or so she thought. She'd seen that look before. It was awe. Kind of sort of like a puppy. She wasn't buying it, though. She needed to nip this thing in the bud, as she would later tell me. She walked over to him and said, and I quote, "What are you staring at?" And without missing a beat, my grandfather, Phillip Harris, said to her, "My wife." Amelia laughed out loud at the audacity of the statement, to which she responded with, "Good luck, sailor." She turned on her heel and went back to her friends, not paying him any mind. He was clearly crazy or had had too much to drink, or both. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 9, Amelia Meets Phil. For the rest of the night, Phil watched Amelia. Mind you, this was 1942, so the idea of creeping just didn't compute. He knew what he saw, which was a woman that he liked, and so he watched. He drank very slowly, nursing his one beer and smoking his trademark stogies. His attention never wavered, it never wandered. Yes, there were other women in the club, but they weren't Amelia. Phil had no place to sleep that night, and as he would later tell me, it never entered his mind. For Amelia's part, she checked back over her shoulder every now and again, but essentially paid that crazy sailor absolutely no mind. Everything must end, and the club began to close. Amelia gathered her things, said her goodbyes, and walked out the door. Phil got his duffel, pretended to drink the last dregs of his beer that he finished an hour ago, and stood to walk out when she walked out. He missed his chance, though, because she walked out with another man. Amelia Stories, Part 1, Section 10, Amelia Meets Phil. Phil got to the door just in time to see Amelia turning the corner alone. That was sort of strange. She was just walking out with some guy. The way he put it, he said, "Remember, this is 1942. It was late. She didn't have a chaperone, so I figured I'd keep an eye on her just to make certain that she got home okay." He kept a safe distance behind her, not too close, but also not so far that he couldn't respond if needed. Amelia got to her bus stop and didn't have to wait for the bus, as it was waiting for her. Apparently, she knew the bus driver. Phil got on the same bus, but she seemingly didn't notice him. She did. She just didn't say anything about it. Clearly, Amelia and the bus driver were friends, and they got involved in a conversation right up until the time that she got off the bus. As Phil would later discover, he was one of Amelia's admirers. Phil slipped past her as she was saying goodbyes to the driver. It was at this point that Phil looked around and went, "Where the hell am I?"